The grand auditorium of the U.S. Naval Operations Command was packed to capacity. White uniforms stretched in perfect rows, brass buttons gleaming under the dome lights. The air hummed with discipline and ceremony, the kind of atmosphere where history seemed to hang in the air. Photographers hovered at the edges, cameras raised like quiet predators. At the very front sat Admiral Marcus Lee, a man whose reputation carried across oceans. His chest bore a wall of ribbons and medals, each earned over decades of service. He had seen heroes rise and fall, legends made and forgotten. It took a lot to impress him. But today, his eyes kept drifting to one name printed in the program. Lieutenant Eva Callahan. He had heard her name whispered in the halls, passed between officers in hushed tones. Rumors mostly, a classified mission, a refusal of honors, something about scars no one talked about. When her name was called, the crowd fell silent. Eva stood in the third row, straight-backed, composed, her movements sharp and deliberate, like muscle memory, not celebration. She didn't smile, didn't scan the audience. She walked to the stage as if it were another drill, another protocol. The announcer's voice echoed, "For extraordinary heroism during classified operations in the South Pacific, Lieutenant Callahan is awarded the Navy Cross." The words, bravery, initiative, valor, sounded hollow. They were sanitized fragments, stripped of the blood and fire of the real mission. No one in the auditorium knew the details. They were still locked away in classified files. But the whispers had spread anyway. A brutal ambush in the jungle. Men dragged from death's edge. A lieutenant who refused medevac despite her own injuries. Some thought the rumors exaggerated. Others thought she had been protected by brass. But no one doubted one thing. Something unforgettable had happened. Admiral Lee studied her as she climbed the steps. Her posture was perfect, almost too perfect. Not prideful, but rigid, like someone who had been carrying invisible weight for too long. She saluted. He rose to meet her, their eyes locked, his sharp and inquisitive, hers steady but sunken, like stone hiding cracks. He pinned the medal against her uniform. The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Officers rose to their feet. Eva didn't flinch. No tears, no smile, just a nod. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," Lee said quietly. "Thank you, sir." Her voice was low, flat. Lee wanted to ask more. What really happened? Why did you refuse this medal once before? Why do you carry yourself like a survivor, not a hero? But this wasn't the place. The ambush. That night, Lee's curiosity pulled him toward her again. As the crowd dispersed, he found her standing alone in the corridor, framed by portraits of fallen heroes. "You refused this medal once," he said. "I did, sir." "Why accept it now?" She studied the portraits, her voice quiet, because no one ever cared to ask why. There was no bitterness in her tone, just exhaustion, the sound of someone who had carried something heavy for too long. Lee frowned. "I authorized that mission, covert insertion, low resistance expected. You were leading recon. I remember the details." Eva turned, meeting his eyes. Her gaze flickered with something raw. "You remember wrong." "How?" "We were sent into a trap, Admiral." Her words were soft, but unwavering. "We weren't supposed to come back." 2 years earlier, the jungle had swallowed her team whole. The helicopter blades thundered overhead as her 5-person squad dropped into the dense, wet dark. The mission was simple. Extract Dr. Thomas Vera, an American scientist kidnapped near the Solomon Islands. Low profile, no firefight. Ghost in, ghost out. But from the moment their boots hit the ground, something felt wrong. The air was too still. No birds, no distant chatter, just silence thick enough to choke on. Eva raised her radio. "Team Bravo, proceed with caution. This might not be what it looks like." Then the jungle exploded. Bullets screamed from the tree line. Mines erupted from the soil. Shouts and gunfire tore the silence apart. "Ambush! Take cover!" Eva roared, diving behind a fallen log. Her comms officer dropped instantly, shot clean through the neck. Another man screamed as shrapnel tore across his leg. The jungle was alive with death. A blast slammed Eva against the dirt. Something sharp tore through her ribs. White-hot pain spread across her chest, but she didn't stop moving. She grabbed Petty Officer Ruiz, blood pouring from his thigh, and dragged him behind a rock. Her own uniform was already soaking with red. Every breath burned. Every step felt like her ribs would collapse. But she kept moving. She hauled one man, then another, then another. For 3 miles through thick jungle, she dragged her team one by one, her own blood mixing with theirs, biting her sleeve to keep from screaming and giving away their position. By dawn, she staggered to the extraction zone. 3 men alive, 1 unconscious, 1 sobbing, 1 barely breathing. She dropped to one knee, vision blurred. A medic sprinted toward her. Jesus Christ, what happened? Eva's voice was a rasp. They're alive. Take them. Then she blacked out. The scars. She woke up in a hospital in Guam, chest bound, tubes in her arms. You're lucky to be alive, a nurse told her. You had internal bleeding, broken ribs. 2 fragments of shrapnel are still inside you, too close to the lung to remove. Eva gestured weakly for a pen. On the hospital chart, she scrawled, "How many survived?" 3, the nurse said softly. Because of you. The Navy wanted statements. The press wanted interviews. Her commanding officer showed up once, holding a recommendation form. You earned this medal, he said. Eva looked him in the eye. Who gave the mission order? He hesitated. Why does it matter? It was a setup. She tore the form in half. 2 months later, she returned to base. Her body worked again, but she moved like a ghost. She trained recruits, performed her duties, and avoided ceremonies. The medal arrived in the mail. She sent it back. Her men thanked her, some with tears. She hugged them, smiled faintly, and returned to silence. At night, she pressed her fingers to the 2 hard lumps beneath her ribs, the fragments of shrapnel still inside her. Not because they hurt, but because she needed to remember it had all been real. Once, a cadet asked her, Is it true you carried 3 men through the jungle without crying? Eva chuckled for the first time in months. I cried, she said. Just not where anyone could see. The revelation. Now 2 years later, she stood across from Admiral Lee in the quiet corridor. You weren't supposed to come back, he said. That's right, Eva replied. Lee's stomach dropped. Are you saying the mission was compromised? Eva's eyes locked on his. I don't think, sir. I know. A silence hung between them, heavy as steel. Finally, she added, If you really want to know why I refused the medal, you need to see what it cost. The corridor outside the auditorium was almost silent. Eva's last words lingered in the air like smoke, words that refused to fade. We were sent into a trap. We weren't supposed to come back. Admiral Marcus Lee had heard many confessions in his decades of service, but never like this. She hadn't sounded bitter or broken. She had sounded certain. He stood there, rooted, watching her walk away with the medal gleaming on her chest, knowing it meant something far darker than honor. That night he couldn't sleep. The ceremony had ended, the crowd gone home, but her voice stayed. He sat in his office long after midnight, coffee gone cold, papers scattered. Curiosity turned to unease, unease to dread. Finally, he opened the classified logs of her mission. Recon South Pacific. Extraction of Dr. Thomas Vera. Minimal resistance expected. A routine op, but the details didn't add up. The intel source wasn't military. It came from Orion Systems, a private defense contractor with lucrative Navy surveillance contracts. A civilian liaison had signed off, someone who should never have been near mission-critical intelligence. Lee's eyes narrowed. This wasn't sloppy work. This was deliberate. The next morning he summoned Eva to his office. She entered with the same rigid posture she had held on stage, scars invisible beneath her uniform, silence heavy in her presence. If we open this door, Lee warned her, it won't close again. Are you ready for that? She didn't flinch. I already live with the truth, Admiral. The question is whether you can. Together they began piecing it apart. Orion had exclusive rights to drone surveillance over the South Pacific. Their reports placed Dr. Vera at the coordinates where Eva's team had been sent. But Vera had been moved 3 days before. Somewhere inside the chain, a false file had been slipped in, a breadcrumb trail leading 5 Navy personnel into the mouth of an ambush. Lee leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down. "This isn't an error," he muttered. "This is orchestration." Eva met his eyes. "They profit every time we bleed. Chaos means new funding, new contracts. My men were expendable because dead sailors make them richer. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they met." Emails disappeared. Files were sealed overnight. One colonel pulled Lee aside with a hushed warning. "Drop this before you get burned." Eva herself received a note slipped into her mailbox, unmarked, unsigned. Heroes don't live long if they ask too many questions. For days she carried the paper folded in her pocket, a reminder of the threat that hung over her. But when her fingers brushed against it, they also touched the scar tissue beneath her ribs, the fragments of shrapnel still lodged in her chest. Each throb reminded her that silence had already cost too much. Lee arranged a closed-door meeting with the Pentagon's Inspector General. In the sterile, windowless room, Eva gave testimony. She described the jungle, the eruption of mines, the bullets cutting down her men, the impossible weight of dragging them through 3 miles of mud and blood. Her voice never shook. When she finished, the officials stared at her in heavy silence. One finally asked, "Lieutenant, why come forward now? You could have accepted your medal quietly, built a career." Eva's jaw tightened. "Because the men who bled in that jungle deserve the truth. And because every sailor after them deserves better than a war sold for profit." No one replied. Lee understood then that she had just made powerful enemies. News didn't leak, it detonated. A whistleblower inside the Pentagon passed Eva's testimony to the press. Overnight, her name splashed across headlines. "Lieutenant claims ambush was set up. Orion systems under fire. Hero or traitor." Talk shows debated whether she was courageous or reckless. Some called her unstable, others hailed her as a patriot. On base, whispers followed her everywhere. Some saluted her with new respect. Others turned their faces, afraid her truth might taint them. Hearings followed. In paneled rooms under the glare of cameras, senators grilled her. Some lauded her courage, others tried to tear her apart. Orion's lawyers painted her as traumatized, confused, desperate for attention. They hadn't expected her to fight back. Instead of defending herself, she told the story again, calm, unshaken. She wrote an op-ed titled "Scars Don't Lie." She described carrying her men through the jungle, the feel of her ribs snapping, the taste of blood in her mouth as she bit her sleeve to keep from screaming. She never named Orion directly, but millions read it, millions shared it, and everyone understood. Letters began pouring in from young recruits and old veterans alike. "You remind us why we serve." Finally, someone says what we all know. The more they tried to silence her, the louder her voice became. The breaking point came in a Senate hearing packed with cameras and reporters. Eva sat at the witness table, uniform immaculate, expression steady. Across from her sat Orion's CEO, a polished man flanked by lawyers. A senator leaned forward. "Lieutenant Callahan, you claim this ambush was orchestrated. Do you have proof?" Eva reached into her folder and laid down a printed email. "This is an internal Orion report, time-stamped 3 days before our mission. It confirms Dr. Vera had already been relocated. Yet they still funneled false intel to the Navy." A murmur swept the chamber. Cameras flashed. The CEO's face drained of color. Eva didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply said, "3 of my men lived. 1 didn't. That's my proof." The scandal tore through Washington. Orion lost billions in contracts. Executives resigned. Investigations spread into lobbying and political donations. Some celebrated Eva as a hero. Others condemned her as dangerous. She was offered protection, but she refused. "I won't hide from the truth," she told Lee. 6 months later, she was quietly discharged. No parade, no farewell, just a line in her file. End of service. She could have vanished then, disappeared into anonymity. Instead, she traveled the country, speaking at academies, to veterans, to recruits barely out of high school. She never spoke of the medal. She spoke of accountability, of scars, of the difference between loyalty and silence. Her conviction carried more weight than any rank ever had. At one lecture, a cadet asked her, "After everything, do you regret it?" Eva paused, fingers brushing unconsciously over her ribs where the shrapnel still rested. Then she smiled faintly. I regret nothing except not speaking sooner. Years later, Admiral Lee watched her on television. She wasn't in uniform now. She wore a simple suit, hair tied back, her presence steady as ever. She stood at a podium before a packed hall of students. Her voice carried calm and unshaken. Heroes aren't the ones who accept medals. They're the ones who live with the scars and refuse to let others be buried under silence. The hall erupted in applause. Lee leaned back in his chair, pride welling in his chest. She had become more than a soldier, more than a survivor. She had become a truth that could not be ignored. And in a world built on silence, that truth was louder than any war drum.